The crowd barely noticed him at first. Just a quiet man in plain clothes holding a mop like he didn't belong anywhere near a fighting arena. The champion laughed the moment he saw him. "Hey, janitor, clean this place after I'm done." People around smirked, some looked away, but no one expected what was about to happen next, because the man they were mocking wasn't just anyone. In a world where appearances decide respect, this champion thought he had already won before the fight even began. He saw weakness, insignificance, someone beneath him. But what he didn't see, what no one saw, was the calm storm standing right in front of him. That janitor slowly put the mop aside, and in just 7 seconds, everything changed. The laughter stopped, the air shifted, and the truth hit harder than any punch ever could. He had just disrespected Bruce Lee. The moment the champion looked at him, the judgment was instant, automatic, and absolute. It didn't come from logic or observation, it came from habit. A lifetime of victories had trained his mind to scan people quickly, to place them into categories: threat or no threat, worthy or unworthy, opponent or background noise. And standing there holding a mop, dressed like someone invisible to the world, this man fell into the lowest category possible. Not even an opponent, not even worth a second glance, just a janitor. That's how underestimation begins. Not with hatred, not with deep thought, but with a quiet dismissal, a belief that someone cannot possibly be dangerous, important, or capable of anything extraordinary simply because they don't look the part. It's the kind of mistake that feels harmless in the moment, almost natural. After all, the world conditions people to believe that greatness always announces itself through fame, appearance, confidence, or reputation. But the truth is far more dangerous. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one no one notices. The champion had built his identity on dominance. Every fight he had won reinforced the idea that he could read people, that he could sense weakness before it even moved. He trusted his instincts more than anything else. And those instincts told him this man was nothing, that he didn't belong in the same space, let alone in the same conversation as a fighter. So he laughed. Not because he was cruel, but because he genuinely believed there was nothing to take seriously. That laughter carried something deeper than humor. It carried certainty, the kind of certainty that blinds people. When someone is so convinced of their own superiority, they stop questioning themselves, they stop considering the possibility that they could be wrong. And that's where underestimation becomes dangerous. Not because it insults others, but because it weakens the person doing the underestimating. Because when you underestimate someone, you don't prepare for them. You don't stay alert. You don't analyze. You don't respect the unknown. You relax in a moment that demands awareness. And in a fight, whether physical or mental, that single moment of relaxation can be everything. The man holding the mop didn't react to the laughter. That was the first thing no one noticed. Most people, when insulted, respond immediately. They defend themselves, argue back, or show anger. But he didn't. He simply stood there, calm, almost detached, as if the words thrown at him had no weight at all. That calmness wasn't weakness, it was control. The kind of control that only comes from deep understanding of oneself, of others, and of situations. But to the champion, it looked like submission. That's the illusion of underestimation. It doesn't just misjudge someone's strength, it misinterprets their silence. It sees patience as fear. It sees humility as inferiority. It sees stillness as a lack of ability. And once that illusion forms, it becomes nearly impossible to break, until reality steps in. The crowd played its part 2. Some laughed along with the champion, feeding his confidence, reinforcing his belief that he was right. Others stayed quiet, unsure, but unwilling to challenge the dominant voice in the room. That's how underestimation spreads. It becomes collective. One person's assumption becomes everyone's reality, and suddenly, the person being underestimated isn't just dismissed by one individual, they're dismissed by an entire environment. But reality doesn't care about assumptions. Reality doesn't care about appearances. Reality only responds to truth. And the truth in that moment was standing quietly, holding a mop, waiting. The champion stepped closer, his confidence growing with every second. He didn't see a challenge. He saw entertainment. A chance to assert dominance, to remind everyone watching why he was the best. That's another hidden layer of underestimation. It turns serious situations into casual ones. It lowers the stakes in your mind, even when the actual stakes remain high. He spoke again, louder this time, making sure everyone could hear. Another joke. Another dismissal. Another moment of arrogance disguised as confidence. Still, no reaction. That silence started to feel strange, even if no one admitted it. Because deep down, there's something unsettling about someone who doesn't respond the way you expect. It creates a small crack in certainty. A quiet question that whispers, "What if there's more here than I'm seeing?" But the champion ignored that whisper. Because acknowledging it would mean questioning himself. And questioning himself was something he had trained himself never to. The man finally moved, not aggressively, not dramatically, just a simple, deliberate motion as he set the mop aside. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't hesitant. It was precise, controlled, intentional. That was the second thing no one understood. Because people expect power to be loud. They expect it to explode into action, to announce itself with energy and intensity. But real power often reveals itself in the smallest movements, in the absence of panic, in the presence of complete control. The champion still didn't see it. To him, it was just a janitor putting down his tool. Nothing more. That's how deep underestimation can go. Even when the truth starts to reveal itself, the mind rejects it. It filters reality through its own beliefs, forcing everything to fit the narrative it has already decided. But reality doesn't bend forever. There comes a moment when it breaks through. And when it does, it doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't warn. It doesn't negotiate. It simply arrives. In that space, in that exact moment, the roles that had been so clearly defined began to dissolve. The champion was no longer facing someone insignificant, and the man he had dismissed was no longer invisible. But the champion didn't realize it yet. Because underestimation has a final stage, the point where the truth is right in front of you, but your mind refuses to accept it. It clings to the illusion even as it starts to collapse. That's why it's so dangerous. Because by the time you realize your mistake, it's already too late. The man stepped forward. Not as a janitor, not as someone trying to prove anything, but as someone who had nothing to prove. And in that moment, the entire balance of the situation shifted. The invisible became visible. The dismissed became undeniable. The underestimated became unstoppable. The champion's confidence, once unshakable, stood on the edge of something it had never faced before. Not just a stronger opponent, but a reality he had completely failed to see. And at the center of it all was Bruce Lee, a man who had spent his life redefining what strength looked like, breaking every assumption about power, speed, and presence. A man who understood something the champion didn't, that the greatest advantage is not just skill but the ability to be underestimated. Because when no one sees you coming, when no one prepares for you, when no one believes you are capable of anything, you don't just win the fight, you control it from the very beginning. There is a moment before every storm where everything appears still, almost too still, as if the world itself is holding its breath. That kind of silence doesn't come from emptiness. It comes from control. From something gathering, focusing, waiting for the exact second to move. Most people don't recognize that moment. They mistake it for nothingness, for hesitation, for weakness. But in reality, it's the most dangerous phase of all. That's what true calm looks like. Not the kind of calm that comes from having nothing to lose, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you are capable of. A deep, unshakable confidence that doesn't need to be displayed, doesn't need to be proven with words or gestures. It simply exists, steady and quiet, beneath the surface. The man standing there, holding the mop just moments ago, carried that kind of calm. It wasn't visible to the untrained eye, To most people, he looked ordinary, maybe even out of place. But calm like that isn't meant to be seen easily. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't try to dominate a room. It stays hidden, reserved, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature. The champion, on the other hand, was the opposite. His energy filled the space, loud and undeniable. Every movement he made demanded attention. Every word he spoke reinforced his presence. That's how he had always operated, through dominance, through visibility, through constant assertion of his strength. And it had worked for him. It had built his reputation, his victories, his identity. But there's a difference between loud confidence and silent certainty. Loud confidence depends on others. It feeds on reactions, on validation, on the need to be acknowledged. It grows stronger when people watch, when they cheer, when they respond. But silent certainty doesn't need any of that. It doesn't rely on the outside world to confirm its existence. It's built internally, through discipline, through understanding, through countless moments of training that no one ever sees. The champion had never needed to understand that difference. His path had been straightforward. Fight, win, repeat. Every challenge he faced looked like a challenge. Every opponent looked like a threat. And that made it easy for him to prepare, to react, to dominate. But what happens when the real challenge doesn't look like one? What happens when the storm doesn't announce itself? That's where calm becomes powerful. Because calm hides intention. It conceals timing. It removes predictability. When someone is loud, when they show everything they feel, everything they plan, they become easier to read. Their energy gives them away. Their movements reveal their thoughts. But when someone is truly calm, there's nothing to read. No signals, no warnings, no clues, just silence. And silence can be terrifying, if you understand it. The champion didn't. To him, silence meant weakness. It meant hesitation. It meant the other person didn't have the courage to respond, to step forward to fight back. That belief made him more confident with every passing second. It made him more careless, more relaxed, more certain that he was in complete control of the situation. But control is an illusion when you don't see everything. The man finally stepped away from the role everyone had assigned to him, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a kind of smooth precision that felt almost effortless. It wasn't just the movement itself, it was the absence of tension in it. No wasted energy, no unnecessary force, just pure, efficient motion. That's what years of mastery create, a state where action doesn't come from impulse, but from intention, where every movement is calculated, even when it looks spontaneous, where the body responds instantly, but never recklessly. That level of calm can't be faked. It's built over time, through repetition, through failure, through deep understanding of both strength and limitation. It requires a person to know themselves completely, to know how they react under pressure, how they think in chaos, how they move when everything is on the line. And once someone reaches that level, something changes. They stop needing to prove themselves. That's why the man hadn't reacted earlier. Not because he couldn't, but because he didn't need to. The words thrown at him had no impact because they didn't challenge his identity. They didn't shake his confidence. They didn't create doubt, because doubt is the enemy of calm, and he had none. The champion, despite all his victories, carried a different kind of energy. It was powerful, yes, but it wasn't stable. It depended on momentum, on maintaining dominance, on keeping control of the narrative. If something unexpected happened, if something disrupted that flow, it could create hesitation, and hesitation, even for a second, is enough. The air in the room began to shift, though no one could explain why. It wasn't something visible. It wasn't something anyone could point to directly. It was a feeling, a subtle change in atmosphere, like the moment before lightning strikes. The kind of moment that makes you pause without knowing the reason. That's the presence of true calm. It doesn't demand attention, but it changes the environment anyway. The champion felt it, even if he didn't understand it. A small, almost imperceptible flicker of uncertainty. A question that didn't fully form, but existed just enough to create discomfort. Why isn't he reacting? Why does he look so unaffected? Those questions didn't last long. His confidence quickly pushed them aside. Because accepting them would mean acknowledging that something was off. Something was different from what he expected. And expectations are powerful. They shape perception. They define reality. They create a framework through which everything is interpreted. When expectations are strong enough, they can override actual evidence. They can make a person ignore what's right in front of them. That's what was happening. The champion saw calm but interpreted it as weakness. He saw control but dismissed it as passivity. He saw silence but believed it meant fear, and that misinterpretation was about to cost him everything. The man's posture changed slightly, not in a way that most people would notice, but enough that everything about him felt different. His center of balance shifted, his focus sharpened. His presence, once invisible, became undeniable. That's the transformation that happens when calm turns into action. It's not loud, it's not chaotic, it's seamless. There's no clear line where stillness ends and movement begins. It just happens, fluid and precise, like water changing direction without resistance. That's why it's so effective. Because by the time you realize it's happening, it's already in motion. The champion was still thinking in terms of dominance, of control, of proving himself. He was preparing for something obvious, something predictable, a reaction, a challenge, a display of aggression. But what he was about to face didn't fit into any of those categories. Because true mastery doesn't follow expectations. It breaks them. And at the center of that calm, that silence, that controlled presence stood Bruce Lee, a man who had built his philosophy around simplicity, efficiency, and adaptability. A man who understood that the most powerful state is not constant aggression but complete control over when and how to act. A man who knew that the calm before the storm is not a pause. It's preparation. Time has a strange way of changing under pressure. In ordinary moments, seconds pass unnoticed, blending into each other without meaning. But in certain situations, when tension reaches its peak, when everything hangs in balance, time slows down. Every fraction of a second stretches, becomes visible, almost tangible, and in those stretched out moments, truth reveals itself with brutal clarity. That's what those 7 seconds were. Not just a brief exchange, not just a quick movement, but a complete collapse of illusion, compressed into a space so small that no one had time to react. No one had time to understand until it was already over. The champion didn't expect anything real to happen. Even as the man stepped forward, even as the atmosphere shifted, his mind still clung to the belief that this was beneath him. That whatever came next would be easy, predictable, manageable. That belief shaped his reaction, or rather, his lack of reaction. Because when you don't believe something is dangerous, you don't prepare for it. You don't tighten your guard. You don't sharpen your focus. You don't anticipate impact. And in a confrontation, those small lapses create openings that can't be closed once they're exploited. The first second passed almost invisibly. No dramatic movement, no obvious signal. Just a subtle shift, weight transferring, focus locking in, intention becoming action. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like nothing at all. But that nothing was everything. It was the moment where decision turned into execution. That's where mastery begins, not in speed, but in precision. Because speed without control is chaos, but controlled speed is unstoppable. The champion realized something was off, but it came too late. His instincts, which had guided him through countless victories, suddenly hesitated. Not because they failed, but because they had been fed the wrong information from the very beginning. They had been told this was not a threat. And now, faced with a reality that contradicted that belief, they needed time to adjust. Time he didn't have. The second hit like a spark igniting dry fuel. Movement, sharp, direct, efficient. No wasted motion, no unnecessary energy, just pure intent translated into action. The kind of movement that doesn't just aim to strike, but to end the moment entirely. The crowd didn't react yet. They couldn't. Their minds were still processing what they were seeing, trying to catch up with something that was already ahead of them. Because what unfolded in those seconds wasn't just fast, it was beyond expectation. It didn't match anything they had prepared to witness. The third second shattered the last remnants of certainty. The champion's confidence, once solid and unbreakable, fractured under the weight of reality. His body tried to respond, tried to recover, but it was already behind. His reactions, trained for speed and strength, couldn't match something that operated on a different level entirely, something that didn't just react but anticipated, adapted, and controlled. That's the difference between skill and mastery. Skill responds, mastery decides. And in that moment, the decision had already been made. The fourth second was where the truth became undeniable, not just to the champion but to everyone watching. The man they had dismissed, the one they had laughed at, was no longer an unknown. His movements carried a clarity, a purpose that couldn't be mistaken. Every action spoke louder than words ever could. This wasn't luck. This wasn't chance. This was something practiced, refined, perfected over time. The kind of ability that doesn't appear suddenly but is built through years of discipline, through endless repetition, through understanding. Not just how to move, but when to move. The fifth second removed any doubt. There are moments in life where realization hits all at once, where everything you believed seconds ago is replaced by something entirely different. This was one of those moments. The champion felt it, not as a thought but as a certainty. He had been wrong, completely, and that realization carried a weight heavier than any physical impact. Because it didn't just challenge his position in that moment, it challenged his entire perception of control, of dominance, of understanding. He wasn't facing someone beneath him. He was facing someone beyond him. The 6th second sealed the outcome. At this point, the physical exchange was almost secondary. The real fight had already been decided in the mind, in the space where confidence either holds or collapses. And the champion's confidence, once his greatest strength, had turned into his greatest weakness. Because it had blinded him, misled him, left him unprepared for something real. And now there was no time to rebuild it, no time to recover, no time to adapt. The 7th second ended everything, not with noise, not with chaos, but with a finality that left no room for interpretation. The kind of ending that doesn't need explanation, because it speaks for itself. The kind of moment that redefines everything that came before it. Silence followed. Not the same silence as before. This was different. Heavier. Filled with realization. With shock. With the sudden awareness that something extraordinary had just happened. The laughter was gone. The arrogance was gone. All that remained was truth. And truth, once revealed, cannot be undone. The crowd stood frozen, their minds replaying, those 7 seconds again and again, trying to understand how something so quick could carry so much impact. How a moment so short could completely change the narrative, flip the roles, expose the reality hidden beneath assumption. Because what they had witnessed wasn't just a physical demonstration, it was a lesson in perception, in preparation, in the danger of certainty. The champion, once so sure of himself, now stood in a different space entirely, not just physically but mentally. The gap between what he thought he knew and what was real had been exposed, and that gap was wider than he had ever imagined. And at the center of it all was Bruce Lee, a man whose philosophy wasn't about overpowering opponents, but about understanding them, adapting to them, and ending conflicts with precision rather than excess. A man who didn't need long battles or drawn-out exchanges to prove anything, because sometimes all it takes is a few seconds, not to show strength, but to reveal truth. Respect is one of the most misunderstood forces in human interaction. People often treat it like something automatic, something that should be given based on titles, appearances, reputation, or status. The champion believed he deserved respect the moment he walked into the room. Not because he demanded it directly, but because everything in his life had reinforced that belief. His victories, his recognition, the way people looked at him, all of it built an identity where respect felt guaranteed. But respect doesn't truly work that way. What people often give is not respect, but recognition. Recognition of success, recognition of dominance, recognition of visible strength. And while recognition can look like respect, it is far more fragile. It depends on what is seen, on what is known, on what has already been proven in front of others. It can be gained quickly, but it can also disappear just as fast. True respect is different. It is not tied to what is visible. It is tied to what is understood. And in that moment, the champion understood nothing. When he looked at the man holding the mop, he didn't see a person. He saw a role, a label. Janitor. And that single word was enough for him to decide everything: how to treat him, how to speak to him, how much value to assign to his presence. That's the danger of labels. They simplify the world, make it easier to process, but they also hide the truth. Because no label can fully define a person. The champion didn't think he was being unfair. From his perspective, he was simply acting according to the structure of the world as he understood it. People in certain positions deserved attention, others didn't. People who looked like fighters were taken seriously, others were not. It was a system that had worked for him, a framework that made his decisions fast and efficient. But efficiency without awareness creates blind spots, and blind spots in critical moments become weaknesses. Respect, real respect, requires awareness. It requires the ability to see beyond immediate appearances, beyond assumptions, beyond the surface-level information that the mind so easily clings to. It requires humility, the understanding that you might not know everything, that you might be wrong, that there could always be more beneath what you see. The champion had never needed that kind of humility. His path had been straightforward. He faced opponents who looked like opponents. He prepared for challenges that were clearly defined. He won, again and again, reinforcing the idea that his way of seeing the world was correct. But the problem with always being right in familiar situations is that it makes you unprepared for unfamiliar ones. The moment he dismissed the man as a janitor, he made a decision that shaped everything that followed. Not just his words, but his mindset. He lowered his guard, not physically at first, but mentally. And mental guard is always the first line of defense. Because before the body reacts, the mind decides how seriously to take a situation. And he had already decided this situation didn't matter. That's the moment where respect should have existed, not as admiration, not as fear, but as a basic acknowledgement of possibility. The possibility that anyone, regardless of how they appear, could be more than they seem. The possibility that the unknown deserves caution. But instead of respect, there was dismissal. And dismissal carries consequences. When you dismiss someone, you don't just insult them, you limit yourself. You close off awareness, you narrow your focus, you remove the need to observe carefully. You stop paying attention, and attention is everything. The man didn't respond to the insult. He didn't demand respect. He didn't argue, didn't try to prove anything with words. That's another thing people misunderstand. Respect cannot be forced. It cannot be demanded into existence. It must be realized. And realization often comes too late. Because people only recognize what they should have respected after they've already made the mistake of not doing so. The champion continued speaking, his tone confident, almost amused. He believed he was in control, that the situation belonged to him. And in a way, it did. Because control often comes from perception. Whoever defines the situation in their mind first gains an advantage. But that advantage only lasts as long as the perception holds true. And his perception was flawed. He thought respect came from being the strongest in the room, from being the most dominant, the most visible, the most acknowledged. And in many situations that belief works. It creates authority, it commands attention, it shapes interactions. But there is a deeper level of respect that exists beneath all of that. A level that has nothing to do with status. It comes from understanding that every person carries unknown potential, that every individual has a story, a set of skills, an experience that cannot be fully seen from the outside, that the moment you assume you know someone completely, you've already made a mistake. That's why real masters don't underestimate, not because they fear others, but because they respect the unknown. The man finally moved, and in that movement something shifted. Not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically. The space between them changed. The dynamic that had been so one-sided suddenly felt different, even if no one could explain why. That's the moment where respect begins. Not when someone demands it, but when reality forces it. The champion felt it, though he didn't immediately understand it. A subtle change, a slight tension, a feeling that something wasn't aligning with his expectations. But expectations are powerful, and they don't break easily. His mind tried to hold on to them, to maintain the narrative he had created, but reality was already moving in a different direction. Respect is often learned through experience, not through theory. It is shaped by moments where assumptions fail, where confidence is tested, where perception proves incomplete. And those moments can be uncomfortable, even painful, because they force a person to confront their own limitations. The champion was about to face that kind of moment. Not because someone wanted to teach him a lesson, but because the situation itself demanded it. Because when you fail to give respect where it is due, the world has a way of correcting you. And that correction doesn't come gently. It comes with clarity, with undeniable evidence, with a shift so strong that it leaves no room for denial. The man he had dismissed was no longer just a figure in the background. His presence had changed. His energy had shifted, and suddenly he couldn't be ignored. The role of janitor no longer fit. It didn't explain what was happening, didn't align with what was being seen. That's when realization begins. When the labels fall apart. When the assumptions collapse. When the truth steps forward. And at the center of that truth stood Bruce Lee, not as a man seeking respect, but as a man who understood it deeply. Someone who knew that respect isn't about being recognized, but about recognizing others. Someone who had built his philosophy not on dominance, but on awareness, adaptability, and understanding. Someone who didn't need to demand respect, because his actions made it inevitable. And in that moment, the champion finally began to understand what respect really meant, not as something he deserved automatically, but as something he should have given from the very beginning.